Every time you react to something you never controlled in the first place, you spend energy you don't get back. Not metaphorical energy. Real, finite, daily energy. The kind you need for the work that actually matters. The people who actually matter. The decisions that actually shape your life. And most of it gets burned on things that were never yours to fix. Notice the moment it happens. Traffic stalls, and your jaw tightens before you've even registered the thought. An email lands with a tone you don't like, and you read it 3 times, drafting a response in your head that gets sharper each pass. A family group chat lights up with the same argument it has every year, and you're pulled in before you've decided to engage at all. None of this is a character flaw. It's a system running in the background. And right now, it's running on the wrong inputs. Here's what almost nobody tells you about this pattern. It isn't really about traffic, or the email, or the family argument. It's about where you're spending a resource you can't refill on demand. And once you see the mechanism clearly, you can't unsee it. Look at how a normal day actually breaks down. The commute that doesn't go your way. The coworker who takes credit in a meeting. The slow reply that shouldn't matter but somehow does. The relative who brings up the same old grievance at every gathering. None of these events is large on its own, but they stack, one after another. And by the afternoon, you've spent a measurable chunk of your focus on things you had zero control over from the start. Most people file this under personality. They think they're just high-strung, or too sensitive, or not as easygoing as some coworker who seems to let everything roll off. That framing misses the actual problem. This isn't a personality trait. It's a resource allocation problem. And once you name it that way, the fix becomes obvious instead of vague. Think about your energy the way you'd think about a battery with a fixed daily charge. Every reaction, every rumination, every 3A.M. replay of a conversation that's already over pulls from that same battery. By the time you get to the work that actually needs your best thinking, there's less left than there should be. Not because the day was unusually hard, because you spent the charge on inputs you never had authority over. There's a common myth that reacting fast is a sign of decisiveness, that the person who fires back immediately is somehow sharper, more in control, more on top of things. It's the opposite. Fast reaction usually means no filter ran at all. The input came in, and the response fired automatically, with zero evaluation of whether the situation was even worth the energy. Decisiveness is choosing where to spend effort. Reactivity is spending it before you've chosen anything. Run this against a normal inbox. A short, blunt email lands from a client or a manager. The automatic response is to read tone into it, draft 3 versions of a reply, second-guess the wording, and lose 15 minutes to something that took the sender 10 seconds to write. None of that time gets logged anywhere. It just quietly disappears from the day. And by the afternoon, you're wondering where your focus went. This is exactly the problem a man named Epictetus solved roughly 2,000 years before anyone had a word for burnout. He didn't approach it as therapy. He approached it as a system, almost an engineering problem, born enslaved with close to zero control over his circumstances. He built a framework precise enough that it still holds up as a practical tool today, not just a historical curiosity. His model splits everything in life into exactly 2 categories: things that are up to you and things that are not up to you. Up to you, your judgments, your choices, your responses. Not up to you, other people's opinions. The weather, how long someone takes to reply, whether traffic clears in the next 5 minutes. Confusing these 2 categories is the single biggest energy leak most people run every day, and almost nobody has ever mapped it out for them directly. This isn't a relaxation technique, it's a filter, and you can apply it in real time. The next time you feel that jaw tighten, that inbox spike your pulse, that group chat pull you in, run one quick check before you respond. Is this within my control or not? If it's within your control, you act cleanly, without wasting extra cycles on the decision itself. If it's not within your control, you drop it immediately, because holding onto it doesn't change the outcome. It just drains the account. That single filter, run consistently, is the difference between a day that leaves you depleted and a day that leaves you with something left over. Marcus Aurelius, running an actual empire, while writing private notes to himself before dawn, used almost the same filter as a daily prep routine. He'd remind himself, in writing, that he was going to encounter people who were meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, difficult, before he'd even left the room, not to feel pessimistic about it, to remove the element of surprise. Because surprise is expensive. Prediction is cheap. Apply that directly. You already know the traffic will be bad some mornings. You already know a certain coworker will take credit where they shouldn't. You already know the family group chat will surface the same old argument at the next holiday. None of that is news. Building that expectation into your baseline means the event, when it happens, costs you almost nothing because you already priced it in. Marcus Aurelius also wrote something closer to a core operating principle than a mood. He said it's not the event itself that disturbs a person. It's the judgment made about the event. The slow email doesn't cost you anything physically. It's the internal story, the assumption about what it means, the imagined confrontation you rehearse before you've even hit reply, that actually drains the account. Strip the story out, and the event becomes almost weightless. One clarification matters here, because otherwise this framework gets misapplied fast. Not reacting doesn't mean absorbing bad behavior silently. It doesn't mean staying quiet when something genuinely requires a direct conversation or a real boundary. The dichotomy of control isn't a system for tolerating disrespect. It's a system for not spending unnecessary energy on the 90% of friction that was never going to change no matter how hard you reacted to it. So you have real capacity left when something actually does require your input. There's a real difference between staying quiet because you have nothing to say and staying quiet because you've decided the situation doesn't deserve your energy. The first is passive. The second is a deliberate allocation decision, and it looks completely different from the outside. Even though both can look like silence, apply the same clarity to family situations, because this is usually where the framework gets tested hardest. The relative who brings up the same old comment at every holiday isn't going to stop because you finally found the perfect response. Their pattern is not within your control, and it likely never will be. What is within your control is how much of the dinner you give to it, whether you engage the topic at all, whether you leave the table for 5 minutes if you need to reset, and whether you decide in advance how much runway you're willing to give it before you redirect the conversation. None of that requires confrontation. It requires a decision made ahead of time instead of a reaction made in the moment. If you've seen the video on energy-draining people, you'll recognize the same underlying mechanic here, applied to a different surface. Those relationships work by pulling your attention and reactivity toward them without your explicit consent. Daily friction, traffic, slow replies. Background family tension runs the exact same play. The only difference is scale. One is a person, the other is the operating conditions of ordinary life. Either way, the leak is identical, and the fix is identical too. Worth being precise about what this system is not. It is not positive thinking. It is not telling yourself the traffic doesn't bother you when it clearly does. It is not suppressing the reaction and calling that progress. Suppression still costs energy, often more than the reaction itself, because now you're spending resources managing the reaction on top of having it. The filter works because it happens before the reaction fully forms, not after, catching the input at the point of entry instead of trying to clean up the aftermath. Run the math on a typical week. The meeting comment you replayed on your drive home, the email you drafted for different ways before sending the short version you should have sent first, the holiday comment you were still thinking about 3 days later, long after everyone else at the table had moved on to something else. That's the real cost of unfiltered reaction, paid in attention and bandwidth. Well, after the triggering event has already ended. Here's the part that actually changes daily output, not just mood. When you stop reacting to things outside your control, you're not just calmer. You have measurably more focus available for the parts of your day that are actually yours to shape. the report that needed real thinking instead of half your attention, the conversation with someone who matters, instead of a distracted version of you still stuck on a comment from 3 hours ago. This is a capacity question, not a mood question. Zoom out to a full week instead of a single day. 5 mornings of traffic, a handful of terse emails, at least one difficult exchange with a coworker, and whatever the family group chat decides to surface, run the old system. React to all of it in real time, and by Friday you're operating on a fraction of the focus you started the week with, without a clear explanation for where it went. Run the filter consistently instead, and that same week leaves you with a measurable surplus, not because the week was easier, but because you stopped paying for things that were never on your invoice to begin with. This compounds. A single day of running the filter barely registers. A month of it changes what your baseline energy looks like by the time you sit down for the work that actually requires your best output. The system isn't dramatic in the moment. It's dramatic in the aggregate, the same way a small daily expense turns into a large annual number once you actually add it up. Notice something else that shifts once the filter becomes automatic. The people around you start to register it too, even if they can't name what changed. The coworker who used to get a reaction out of you stops getting one, and eventually stops bothering because the payoff disappeared. The relative who used to draw you into the same argument every year finds the conversation doesn't go anywhere anymore, not because you shut them down, but because you simply stop supplying the fuel. None of that requires an announcement. It just becomes the new default, quietly, one filtered response at a time. None of this requires talent or a personality transplant. It requires running the same short check before you respond, consistently, until it stops feeling like a step and starts feeling like how you naturally operate. Walk through a normal day with the filter running. Traffic stalls on the way in. The filter runs automatically now, almost before you notice it. Not within my control. The jaw doesn't get the full grip it used to. You arrive with more bandwidth intact than you would have otherwise. Midday. A coworker takes credit for something you did in a meeting. The filter runs again. Their behavior in that meeting, not within your control. Whether you address it directly afterward, whether you document your contribution going forward, whether you raise it with a manager if it becomes a pattern, that's within your control. And it's a completely different kind of response than stewing on it silently for the rest of the afternoon. Evening, the family group chat lights up with the same argument that shows up at every gathering. The filter runs a third time. Their opinions, their grievances, their need to relitigate the same point, not within your control. Whether you engage, how much of your evening you give it, whether you mute the thread until you're ready to look at it with a clear head, that part is entirely yours. None of these situations disappear. Traffic is still traffic. The coworker is still difficult. The family chat is still the family chat. What changes is where your energy goes, and by extension, what you have left for the parts of the day that were actually supposed to be yours. Build this into an actual routine instead of treating it as something you only remember when things are already going sideways. A short check-in at the start of the day, 30 seconds, naming the 2 or 3 things most likely to trigger a reaction before they happen. Traffic, a specific coworker, a specific thread. Pricing those in ahead of time means the filter is already loaded when the moment actually arrives, instead of being invented under pressure in real time. A second check-in at the end of the day works just as well. Reviewing what actually pulled your focus and separating what was genuinely worth the energy from what wasn't. Over a few weeks, that second check-in starts doing most of the work on its own, because the pattern becomes obvious once you're tracking it instead of just living through it. This isn't about becoming detached or robotic. You'll still notice friction when it happens. The difference is what you do with it in the next few seconds, because that's the only part of the equation you were ever actually running. Seneca put this more bluntly than almost anyone else in the tradition in a letter about exactly this problem. He pointed out that we don't have a shortage of time. We have a habit of wasting the time we do have and that people are far more careful guarding their money than they are guarding the one resource that never comes back once it's spent. Time and attention spent on things outside your control don't come back at the end of the day like a refund. They're gone, permanently, spent on an outcome you never had authority over to begin with. Every minute spent replaying a comment, refreshing an inbox, rehearsing an argument that already happened, is a minute withdrawn from an account that doesn't refill on its own. The person who said the thing has likely already moved on. You're the only one still running the transaction, and you're the only one who can close it. Consider how much of a typical year gets spent this way once you actually total it up. A few minutes here for a comment that didn't land right. A few more there for a slow reply that probably meant nothing. An entire evening occasionally, lost to a single exchange that felt urgent at the time and means nothing a week later. None of it shows up on a calendar or a to-do list. It just quietly disappears, spent on outcomes that were never yours to determine in the first place. And the total, over months, is larger than almost anyone expects until they actually look at it directly. Reclaim that. Every minute you get back from not relitigating things outside your control is a minute available for something that's actually yours. The work that needs real focus. The person across the table who deserves your full attention instead of a distracted version of you still stuck on traffic from 2 hours ago. Compare the two versions of you across an average month. One version runs no filter, absorbs every input at full intensity, and ends most days running on fumes without ever quite knowing why. The other runs the same filter consistently, drops what was never controllable, and ends most days with something left over. Not because the month was easier, but because the accounting was different the entire way through. The events were identical, the output wasn't. This is a system, not a personality overhaul. You run the filter, you act where you have authority, you drop what you don't, and over time the difference shows up less as a feeling and more as a measurable shift in how much you actually have left at the end of the day. Week over week, without needing to feel especially motivated on any single one of them. What's one thing outside your control that's been draining your energy this week? Drop it in the comments below. Naming it is the first step to actually letting it go. Seneca closed his own argument on this with a line worth carrying forward. He said it isn't that we have a short life, it's that we waste a great deal of it, spending what we're given on things that were never worth the cost. Stop paying for what was never yours to control. What's left is yours to spend on purpose.